The autumn fog of 1908 clung to the cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill like a shroud, muffling the clip-clop of horse-drawn carriages and the distant whistle of steamships in Boston Harbor. Inside the imposing red brick mansion at 47 Marlborough Street, the Ashworth family was preparing for what would become the most haunting day of their lives, though none of them knew it yet. Charles Ashworth stood at the tall windows of his study, watching the gaslit street lamps flicker to life in the early evening gloom. His textile mills had made him one of Boston's wealthiest men, but lately, an inexplicable unease had settled over him like the persistent fog outside. His wife Eleanor had been insisting they commission a family portrait, something to commemorate their prosperity and their beautiful daughters. "Charles, dear, Mr. Whitmore will be arriving shortly with his camera equipment," Eleanor called from the hallway, her voice carrying the refined accent of Boston's elite. She appeared in the doorway wearing an emerald silk dress that complemented her auburn hair, perfectly arranged despite the humid weather. "The girls are nearly ready, and I've asked Bridget to ensure Thomas is presentable as well." Charles turned from the window, adjusting his gold pocket watch. "I still question the wisdom of including the helps boy in a formal family portrait, Eleanor. What will our associates think?" Eleanor's expression softened with the maternal warmth that had drawn Charles to her 12 years ago. "Oh, Charles, the children adore him so. Margaret and Catherine have grown quite fond of little Thomas, and he's been such a well-behaved child. Besides, it shows our charitable nature, does it not?" From somewhere upstairs came the sound of children's laughter, followed by hurried footsteps across the hardwood floors. 8-year-old Margaret's voice echoed down the grand staircase, calling for her younger sister Catherine to hurry. The Ashworth children were the pride of their parents' hearts, Margaret, with her golden ringlets and serious demeanor, already showing signs of the intelligent woman she would become, and 6-year-old Catherine, blonde and vivacious, with eyes that sparkled like cut sapphires. Bridget O'Malley emerged from the kitchen, smoothing her black uniform and adjusting the white lace cap that marked her station. The Irish woman had been with the family for 3 years, arriving shortly after a terrible fire had destroyed much of the city's Irish quarter. She was efficient, quiet, and devoted to the children, though Charles had always found something peculiar about her nervous glances and the way she sometimes seemed to be listening for sounds that others couldn't hear. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Ashworth," Bridget said in her lilting accent, "but the children are ready now and Thomas is with them. Such a good lad he is, never causing trouble, always minding his manners." Charles nodded absently, though something about Bridget's tone struck him as odd. There was an quality to her voice when she spoke of Thomas, as if she were reciting lines from a play rather than speaking naturally about her son. He had never seen the boy misbehave or speak out of turn, which was unusual for a child of 7. In fact, Thomas seemed almost unnaturally well-behaved, appearing and disappearing from rooms with the quiet grace of a shadow. The doorbell's brass chime announced the arrival of Edmund Whitmore, Boston's most sought-after portrait photographer. His reputation for capturing the essence of his subjects had made him the preferred choice among the city's wealthy families. Charles heard Eleanor greeting the man in the foyer, their voices mingling with the sound of heavy equipment being moved into the house. As Charles made his way toward the parlor where the portrait would be taken, he passed the servants' staircase and caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows above. For just a moment, he could have sworn he saw a small figure watching him from the darkness of the upper landing, but when he looked again, there was nothing there except the play of lamplight against the wallpaper. The parlor had been transformed for the occasion. The heavy velvet drapes had been drawn back to allow the last of the natural light to filter through the tall windows, and additional oil lamps had been arranged to provide the illumination Mr. Whitmore required for his equipment. The photographer himself was a thin, precise man with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers, adjusting his large camera on its wooden tripod with the careful attention of a scientist preparing an experiment. "Ah, Mr. Ashworth," Whitmore said without looking up from his camera. "Mrs. Ashworth has explained that we'll be photographing your daughters along with a 3rd child. Quite modern of you to include household staff in a family portrait, though I must say it's becoming more common among Boston's progressive families." Before Charles could respond, the children entered the room in a flutter of rustling fabric and excited whispers. Margaret wore a pristine white dress with delicate lace trim, her golden hair adorned with a silk ribbon. Little Catherine bounced beside her in a matching dress, though smaller and with additional bows that suited her playful nature. Between them walked Thomas, and Charles felt that familiar chill that seemed to accompany the boy's presence. Thomas was dressed in simple but clean clothes, dark trousers, and a white shirt that Bridget had obviously pressed with great care. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his pale skin seemed almost luminous in the lamplight. What struck Charles most, as it always did, were the boy's eyes. They held a depth that seemed inappropriate for a child of 7, as if he had seen far more of the world than any child should. "Oh, how lovely they look together," Eleanor exclaimed, clasping her hands in delight. "Mr. Whitmore, please ensure you capture how beautifully they complement each other." The photographer nodded, making final adjustments to his equipment. The large camera, with its accordion-like bellows and brass fittings, dominated one corner of the room, like some mechanical creature poised to capture souls rather than images. Whitmore disappeared beneath the black cloth that covered the camera's back, his muffled voice directing the children to their positions. Margaret and Catherine stood close together, their hands folded properly as they had been taught, while Thomas positioned himself slightly behind them, his expression serene but somehow ancient. As the children held their poses, Charles noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat. In the large mirror that hung on the parlour's far wall, he could clearly see the reflection of his 2 daughters, their white dresses bright against the dark wood panelling. Eleanor stood beside him, her emerald dress a splash of colour in the reflected room. Even the photographer was visible, bent over his equipment in concentrated preparation. But where Thomas stood between his daughters, there was only empty space in the mirror's surface. Charles blinked hard and looked again, certain his eyes were playing tricks on him in the uncertain light. But the mirror showed the same impossible scene, 2 little girls with a mysterious gap between them, as if the third child casting no reflection at all. "Everyone remain perfectly still now," came Whitmore's voice from beneath the camera cloth. "This will require several seconds of absolute stillness." The flash powder ignited with a brilliant burst of white light, filling the room with acrid smoke and the sharp smell of chemicals. In that brief blinding moment, Charles thought he heard something that chilled him to his very core, the sound of a child sobbing, though all 3 children in the room remained perfectly, unnaturally still. As the smoke cleared and his vision returned, Charles looked frantically at the mirror again. Now it showed all 3 children clearly, as if nothing had been amiss. But the memory of what he had seen, or rather, what he had not seen, would haunt him for the rest of his days. "Excellent," Whitmore announced, emerging from beneath his camera cloth. "I believe we've captured something quite remarkable. If only he had known how terrifyingly accurate those words would prove to be." 3 days after the portrait session, the Ashworth household had settled into its usual rhythm, though Charles found himself studying every mirror he passed with new-found suspicion. The autumn wind rattled the windows with increasing ferocity, and the gas lamps seemed to flicker more frequently, casting dancing shadows that made him question what was real and what was merely the product of an overactive imagination. It was during the quiet hour after dinner, when Eleanor was reading to the children in the nursery, that Charles decided to seek answers. He had noticed Bridget's increasingly nervous behaviour since the photograph had been taken, and the way she seemed to avoid looking directly at Thomas when she thought no one was watching. He found her in the kitchen, scrubbing the dinner dishes with unusual intensity, her knuckles white against the ceramic. The large room, with its cast-iron stove and hanging copper pots, felt colder than it should have, despite the fire burning steadily in the hearth. "Bridget," Charles said quietly, not wanting to startle her, "I wonder if I might have a word with you." The Irish woman's hands stilled for a moment before she continued washing, though her movements became more agitated. "Of course, Mr. Ashworth. Is there something wrong with me work?" "Not at all. Your service has been exemplary." Charles moved closer, studying her profile in the lamplight. "I wanted to speak with you about Thomas." At the mention of the boy's name, Bridget's entire body tensed. A plate slipped from her soapy hands and shattered against the stone floor, the sound echoing through the kitchen like a gunshot. She immediately dropped to her knees, frantically gathering the pieces. "Oh, forgive me, sir, so clumsy I am tonight. I'll replace it from me own wages, I will." Charles knelt beside her, his voice gentle but firm. "Leave it, Bridget. Tell me about your son." Her hands froze among the ceramic shards, and when she looked up at him, he saw something in her eyes that he had never seen before, pure, undiluted terror. "Me son, sir." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, Thomas. How long have you had him?" Bridget's breath came in short, sharp gasps, and Charles realized she was on the verge of panic. She sat back on her heels, her face pale as morning frost. "Mr. Ashworth, I must tell you something, but you'll think me mad. You will." Charles helped her to her feet, guiding her to one of the kitchen chairs. I assure you, whatever you have to say, I will listen with an open mind. Bridget wrung her hands in her apron, her Irish accent becoming thicker with emotion. The truth is, Sir Thomas isn't me son. I never had a child, Mr. Ashworth. Never been blessed with one of me own. The words hit Charles like a physical blow. What do you mean? The boy has been living in your quarters for months. Aye, he has. But I swear on me mother's grave, I never gave birth to that child. Tears began to flow down her weathered cheeks. When I first came to work for your family, I was alone in the world. Me husband died in the fire that took our home, and I had nowhere else to go. You and Mrs. Ashworth were so kind to take me in. Charles leaned forward, his heart beginning to race. Then who is Thomas? That's just it, sir. I don't rightly know. Bridget's voice dropped to a terrified whisper. He just appeared one morning, about 6 months after I started working here. I woke up and there he was, sitting at the foot of me bed like he'd always been there. When I asked him where he came from, he just smiled and said he lived here now, that he belonged with the children. Why didn't you tell us immediately? Bridget's hands shook as she wiped her eyes. I tried to, sir, I truly did, but every time I opened me mouth to speak the truth, the words wouldn't come. It was as if something was stopping me from telling you. And then you and Mrs. Ashworth just seemed to accept him as if he'd always been part of the household. You never questioned why your maid suddenly had a son she'd never mentioned before. Charles felt a chill run down his spine as he realized she was right. When had he first noticed Thomas? He couldn't remember a specific moment when the boy had been introduced to the family. It was as if Thomas had simply always been there, a fact they had all accepted without question. The children took to him immediately. Bridget continued, her voice growing more distressed. Margaret and little Catherine adore him, and he's never been anything but kind to them. But, sir, there's something not right about that boy. He doesn't eat the food I prepare for him, though he sits at the table and pretends to. I've never seen him sleep, though he lies in the bed I made for him. And sometimes in the dead of night I hear him talking to someone, but there's never anyone there. What does he say? He talks about the other children, sir. Children who used to live in this house. He knows things about this place that he shouldn't know. Things that happened before any of us ever set foot here. Charles remembered the mirror incident during the portrait session, and a terrible understanding began to dawn on him. Bridget, do you know the history of this house? Who lived here before we purchased it? The maid nodded slowly, her face grave. I took the liberty of speaking with Mrs. Henley next door, sir. This house, it has a dark past. The previous owners were the Blackwood family. They had 3 children, sir, 2 daughters and a son. What happened to them? There was a terrible accident in the winter of 1905, just a year before you bought the house. A fire started in the nursery during the night. The 2 daughters escaped with their parents, but their son, a boy of 7 years old, he perished in the flames. They found his body in the very room where Thomas sleeps now. The kitchen seemed to grow colder as Bridget spoke, and Charles could swear he heard the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway above, though he knew Eleanor and the children were in the nursery on the opposite end of the house. The Blackwood boy's name, sir, Bridget whispered, her voice barely audible. It was Thomas. At that moment, the gas lamp above the kitchen table flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. In the brief moment before Charles could relight it, he heard something that made his blood freeze, the sound of a child's laughter echoing from somewhere within the walls themselves. When the light returned, Bridget was staring at the doorway that led to the servants' stairs, her face white with terror. He's listening, sir, she whispered. He always is. From upstairs came the sound of Margaret calling for Thomas to come play, her voice filled with innocent joy. But Charles no longer heard the call of a living child to a playmate. Now it sounded like an invitation to something far more sinister, a dead boy who had found a way to return to the world of the living and who had no intention of leaving the family he had claimed as his own. The portrait that Mr. Whitmore was developing in his studio would soon reveal more than anyone bargained for. But by then, it might be too late to save the Ashworth children from the supernatural bonds that were already beginning to form around them, binding them to a lonely spirit who'd been waiting 3 years for someone to fill the empty space in his broken heart. The next morning brought no relief from the growing dread that had settled over Charles like a suffocating blanket. He had barely slept, his mind racing with the implications of Bridget's confession. Every creak of the old house, every whisper of wind through the shutters, seemed to carry the presence of the dead boy who walked among them. Eleanor noticed his distraction at breakfast, though she attributed it to business concerns. The children chattered happily about their lessons for the day, while Thomas sat quietly beside them, cutting his breakfast sausage with precise, careful movements that he never actually ate. Charles watched him with new eyes, noting how the morning sunlight streaming through the dining room windows seemed to pass through the boy rather than illuminate him. "Papa, when will we see our portrait?" Margaret asked, her golden curls catching the light as she turned toward him. "Mr. Whitmore said it would be ready soon." "Very soon, darling," Charles replied, though the thought of seeing that photograph now filled him with apprehension. "I'm sure it will be quite revealing." Thomas looked up at the word, his dark eyes meeting Charles's gaze with an intensity that made the man's skin crawl. For just a moment, the boy's face seemed to change, becoming gaunt and marked with shadows that spoke of fire and death. Then he smiled, and he was simply a 7-year-old child again, innocent and beautiful. After breakfast, Charles decided he could wait no longer. He told Eleanor he had business in the city and made his way through the fog-shrouded streets to Edmund Whitmore's photography studio on Newbury Street. The photographer's workshop occupied the ground floor of a narrow brownstone, its windows designed to capture the perfect northern light that was essential for his craft. Whitmore greeted him with the enthusiasm of an artist eager to display his work. "Ah, Mr. Ashworth, perfect timing. I've just finished developing your family portrait, and I must say it's quite extraordinary, perhaps the most remarkable photograph I've ever produced." The studio smelled of chemical baths and silver nitrate, and Charles could see several portraits in various stages of development, hanging from lines like ghostly laundry. Whitmore led him to a large table where the finished photograph lay under a protective cloth. "I must warn you," Whitmore said, his excitement tempered by confusion. "There are some unusual qualities to this image that I cannot fully explain. The photographic process sometimes captures things that the human eye might miss, but this—" He pulled away the cloth, revealing the portrait of the 3 children. Charles felt the breath leave his lungs as if he had been struck. The photograph showed Margaret and Catherine exactly as they had appeared during the session, their white dresses pristine, their expressions perfectly captured. But Thomas— the boy in the photograph was not the same child who had posed for the picture. This Thomas was translucent, his image overlaying the background like a double exposure. His clothes appeared scorched and tattered, and his face bore the unmistakable marks of burns. Most horrifying of all, his eyes in the photograph were not the gentle dark eyes of the boy they knew, but hollow sockets that seemed to stare directly into the viewer's soul. "I've checked and rechecked my equipment," Whitmore said, his voice shaking slightly. "There was no technical error, no problem with the photographic plates, yet this is what the camera captured. It's as if the boy in your household exists on 2 different planes simultaneously." Charles gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "Have you shown this to anyone else?" "Good heavens, no, I wouldn't dream of it. But Mr. Ashworth, I must ask, is there something you haven't told me about that child? Because this photograph suggests something quite impossible." Before Charles could answer, a cold draft swept through the studio, despite all the windows being closed. The gas lamps flickered, and for a moment Charles could swear he saw a small figure standing in the corner of the room, watching them with hollow, burning eyes. "Mr. Whitmore," Charles said carefully, "I need you to make me 3 copies of this photograph, and then I need you to destroy the original plate. Can you do that?" The photographer nodded slowly, though his confusion was evident. "Of course, but may I ask why? This is perhaps the most scientifically significant photograph I've ever taken. It could change our understanding of the photographic process itself." "Some discoveries are too dangerous to share," Charles replied. "Trust me on this matter." As Whitmore began preparing the copies, Charles studied the photograph more closely. In the background, barely visible but definitely present, he could make out the faint outlines of 2 other figures, a man and woman who bore no resemblance to anyone in the Ashworth household. They appeared to be reaching toward Thomas with expressions of desperate longing. "The previous owners," Charles whispered to himself, understanding flooding through him. The Blackwood parents, still bound to this world by their grief over their lost son, still trying to reach him across the divide between life and death. When Whitmore finished the copies, Charles took them with hands that trembled slightly. "Remember what I said about the original plate? It will be destroyed today," Whitmore assured him. "But Mr. Ashworth, if I might offer some advice, whatever situation you find yourself in regarding that child, I would suggest you seek help. There are forces in this world that photography can reveal, but that we are not equipped to handle." Charles tucked the photographs into his coat and hurried back through the streets toward home. But as he walked, he became aware of a growing commotion ahead. Smoke was rising from the direction of Beacon Hill, and the sound of fire bells echoed through the fog. His heart began to race as he realized the smoke was coming from his own street. Breaking into a run, he rounded the corner onto Marlborough Street, to find a crowd gathered in front of his house. Fire wagons lined the street, their horses stamping nervously in the cold air. "Eleanor!" he shouted, pushing through the crowd. "My children!" He found his wife standing safely on the sidewalk with Margaret and Catherine, all three wrapped in blankets. Eleanor's face was streaked with tears and soot. "Charles, thank God you're here," she cried, falling into his arms. There was a fire in the nursery. It started so suddenly we barely had time to escape. "Was anyone hurt?" Charles asked frantically, looking over his daughters to ensure they were unharmed. "No, we're all safe," Eleanor said. The fire department arrived quickly and contained it to just the one room. But Charles, the strangest thing, Thomas was in the nursery when the fire started, but when we escaped, he wasn't with us. The firemen searched everywhere, but they found no trace of him. Charles felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "Are you certain he was in the room when the fire began?" "Absolutely certain," Margaret piped up, her young voice serious. "He was playing with us when the flames appeared. But Papa, he didn't seem frightened at all. He just smiled and said he was going home." Catherine nodded solemnly. "He walked right into the fire, Papa. He walked into it like it was just warm sunshine." Charles looked up at the second-story window where smoke still drifted from the nursery, and in that moment, he understood. Thomas had returned to the place where he had died, drawn back by the very element that had claimed his life 3 years ago. The lonely spirit had found the family he craved, had tasted the warmth of belonging, but ultimately could not escape the tragedy that bound him to this world. As the fire crews finished their work and the crowd began to disperse, Charles quietly showed Eleanor one of the photographs. Her face went pale as she stared at the image of the burned and translucent child. "We need to leave this house," he said quietly. "Tonight." Eleanor nodded, understanding without need for explanation. They had been host to something that should not exist, and while Thomas might be gone for now, the forces that had brought him back once could surely do so again. But as they prepared to gather their belongings and seek temporary lodging elsewhere, none of them noticed the small figure watching from the third-floor window, or the way the burned nursery suddenly felt warm again, as if heated by invisible flames that would never truly go out. The Parker House Hotel on School Street had always represented luxury and sophistication to Boston's elite, but to Charles Ashworth, it now served as a fortress against the supernatural forces that had invaded his home. The family had taken a suite on the third floor, far from their haunted mansion on Marlborough Street. Yet Charles found that distance provided little comfort. It had been 3 days since the fire, 3 days since Thomas had walked into the flames and seemingly vanished forever. Eleanor busied herself with the children, reading them stories and playing games to distract them from the trauma they had witnessed. Margaret and Catherine seemed remarkably resilient, though Charles noticed they often glanced toward empty corners of their hotel room as if expecting someone to appear. On the 4th evening, as Charles sat in the hotel's oak-paneled lobby reading the evening paper, he was approached by a distinguished gentleman with silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles. The man's bearing suggested education and authority, and when he spoke, his voice carried the measured tones of academia. "Mr. Ashworth, I am Professor Jonathan Blackwood from Harvard University." Charles felt his blood turn to ice at the familiar surname. "Blackwood? Yes. I believe you are currently residing in my family's former home." The professor's expression was grave, tinged with a sorrow that seemed to have aged him beyond his years. "I was informed of the recent fire by a friend at the fire department. I think it's time we spoke." Charles set down his newspaper with trembling hands. "Professor, I believe I owe you an explanation about what has been happening in your house." "On the contrary, Mr. Ashworth, I owe you an explanation about my son." They moved to a quiet corner of the lobby where the professor began his story, his voice heavy with grief and guilt. "Thomas was our youngest child, born in 1898. He was a bright, curious boy who loved his sisters dearly. When the fire took him in 1905, my wife and I were consumed by grief and guilt. We moved to Cambridge, unable to bear living in the house where our son had died." Professor Blackwood paused, removing his spectacles to clean them with shaking hands. "What you may not understand, Mr. Ashworth, is that my wife and I have spent the last 3 years studying spiritualism and the occult, desperate to make contact with our lost child. We have consulted mediums, attended séances, and researched every manner of supernatural phenomenon." "Did you ever succeed in contacting him?" "More than we bargained for," the professor replied grimly. "About 6 months ago, we performed a ritual designed to call Thomas back to us. We believed that our love and longing could bridge the gap between the living and the dead. We were successful, but not in the way we intended. Charles leaned forward, understanding beginning to dawn. He didn't come to you. No. He appeared in his former home, drawn to the place where he had died, but also to the living children who now occupied his space. You see, Mr. Ashworth, when a child dies traumatically, their spirit often becomes confused about its state. Thomas doesn't fully understand that he's dead. He simply knows he wants to belong to a family again. But why could we see him? Why did he seem so real? Professor Blackwood's expression darkened. Because our ritual didn't just call his spirit back, it gave him the power to manifest physically in the world of the living. He has become what occultists call a corporeal revenant, a spirit so powerful it can interact with the physical world as if it were alive. Before Charles could respond, a commotion erupted near the hotel's entrance. Eleanor's voice, high and panicked, called out from the stairway. Charles, come quickly! Something's wrong with the children! Charles and Professor Blackwood raced up the stairs to find Eleanor standing in the doorway of their suite, her face pale with terror. Inside the room, Margaret and Catherine sat on their beds, perfectly still, their eyes focused on the far corner where shadows gathered despite the bright electric lighting. Hello, Papa, Margaret said in a voice that was eerily calm. Thomas has come back to play with us. Charles felt his heart stop as he saw the familiar figure materializing in the corner. Thomas appeared exactly as he had in life, no longer the burned spectre from the photograph. He smiled at the girls with genuine affection, but when his gaze fell upon Professor Blackwood, his expression changed to one of confusion and hurt. Father? Thomas's voice was a whisper that seemed to come from very far away. Why did you leave me? Why didn't you come back for me? Professor Blackwood stepped forward, tears streaming down his face. Thomas, my dear boy, we tried to find you. We've been searching for you. But I was waiting, Thomas said, his form beginning to flicker like a candle flame in the wind. I waited in our house, but you never came. So I found a new family. Margaret and Catherine love me. They want me to stay with them. Charles moved protectively toward his daughters, but found he could not get closer to their beds. An invisible force held him back, as if the air itself had become solid. Thomas, Professor Blackwood said gently, you can't stay with them. You don't belong in their world anymore. You belong with us, with your real family. The boy's face contorted with anger, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost began forming on the windows, and the electric lights flickered ominously. They are my real family now, Thomas screamed, and his voice was no longer that of a child but something ancient and terrible. I died alone and afraid, and no one came for me. But Margaret and Catherine accepted me. They played with me. They made me feel alive again. Eleanor tried to reach for her daughters, but like Charles, she found herself unable to move closer. Margaret and Catherine remained unnaturally still, their eyes fixed on Thomas with expressions of adoration that seemed wrong on their young faces. I won't let you take them from me, Thomas continued, his form now shifting between the innocent child and the burned spectre from the photograph. And I won't let you take me from them. We're going to be together forever. The hotel room began to shake, and Charles heard screams from the other guests as supernatural forces rippled through the building. Pictures fell from walls, and the very foundations seemed to groan under the weight of Thomas's rage. Professor Blackwood raised his voice above the chaos. Thomas, listen to me. There is a way for us to be together again, but not like this. Not by stealing other children from their families. The shaking stopped abruptly, and Thomas turned his burning gaze upon his father. How? There is a ritual, a way to bring the dead back to life permanently, but it requires a sacrifice, a willing exchange of life force. Charles felt a chill that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold filling the room. Professor, what are you suggesting? The old man's face was resolute, though tears continued to stream down his cheeks. I am an old man, Mr. Ashworth. My wife died last year from grief over our lost son. I have spent every day since Thomas's death wishing I could trade places with him. Perhaps it's time I stopped wishing and took action. Thomas's expression softened, and for a moment he looked like nothing more than a confused, lonely little boy. Father, I don't understand. I can give you my life force, Thomas. You can live again, truly live, but in exchange, I will take your place in death. We can finally be reunited, just not in the way your mother and I originally planned. The implications of Professor Blackwood's proposal hung in the air like a death sentence. But before anyone could respond, Thomas began to fade, his form becoming translucent once more. I need time to think, he whispered, but Margaret and Catherine will stay with me while I decide. They're safe, as long as no one tries to separate us. With that, the boy vanished, but his presence remained like a weight pressing down on everyone in the room. Margaret and Catherine finally moved, turning to look at their parents with expressions that were subtly wrong, as if they were looking through Thomas's eyes rather than their own. Charles realized with growing horror that his daughters were no longer entirely themselves. Thomas had taken more than just their affection. He had begun to claim their very souls. The escape to the hotel had failed. If anything, Thomas was now stronger than ever, and the children Charles had sought to protect were slipping further away from the world of the living with each passing moment. The next morning brought no dawn to the Ashworth family. Outside their hotel windows, an unnatural twilight hung over Boston, as if Thomas's presence had somehow dimmed the very sun itself. Margaret and Catherine sat at the small table in their suite, playing a card game that Charles had never seen before, their movements synchronized in a way that chilled him to his core. "Good morning, Papa," they said in perfect unison, their voices carrying an echo that seemed to come from somewhere far beneath the earth. Eleanor clutched Charles's arm, her fingernails digging into his sleeve. "They've been like this since we woke up," she whispered. "They speak together, move together, and Charles, they know things they shouldn't know." "What kind of things?" "They told me about a fire that happened in this very hotel in 1889, about guests who died in rooms we've never been to. They described the layout of our house in perfect detail, including rooms that were sealed off before we ever moved in." Charles approached his daughters carefully, noting how their skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality. When Margaret looked up at him, her blue eyes seemed deeper than before, as if they now contained depth that a 6-year-old could never possess. "We've been waiting for you to wake up, Papa," Margaret said, with a smile that was beautiful and terrible at once. "Thomas wants to show us something special today." "Where is Thomas?" Charles asked, though he suspected the answer would chill him. "He's here," Catherine replied, pointing to the empty chair beside her. "He's always here now. He says we don't need to be afraid anymore because we're going to be together forever." As if summoned by her words, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, and Thomas materialized in the chair Catherine had indicated. But this was not the innocent child who had first appeared in their home. This Thomas was clearly a creature of death and shadow, his clothes bearing the char marks of fire, his eyes holding the hollow darkness of the grave. "Good morning, Mr. Ashworth," Thomas said with adult politeness that sounded wrong coming from a child's lips. "I trust you slept well, though I imagine you had some troubling dreams." Charles had indeed experienced nightmares unlike any he had ever known, visions of his daughters burning in phantom fires, of their voices calling to him from places where the living could not follow. "What have you done to my children?" Thomas tilted his head with the curious expression of a child examining an interesting insect. "I've shared with them what I've learned about the space between life and death. They're beginning to understand that the boundaries we accept as absolute are really quite flexible." Professor Blackwood, who had spent the night in an adjoining room, entered at that moment. His appearance had deteriorated dramatically overnight. His hair had gone completely white, and deep lines had etched themselves into his face as if he had aged 20 years in a single evening. "Thomas," he said quietly, "have you considered my proposal?" The ghost boy turned his attention to his father, and for a moment his expression softened with something that might have been love. "I have thought of little else, Father, but I've also been thinking about what I would be giving up." "You would be giving up this unnatural existence, this half-life between worlds." "Would I?" Thomas stood and moved to where Margaret and Catherine sat, placing his translucent hands on their shoulders. "Or would I be giving up the first real family I've had since I died? These children have accepted me without question or fear. They've given me something you and Mother never could after my death, the feeling of being truly alive." Charles noticed that where Thomas touched his daughters, their skin seemed to grow even paler, as if he were drawing some essential essence from them. "Thomas, you're hurting them," Charles said desperately. "Am I?" Thomas looked genuinely puzzled. "They don't seem to be in pain. Do you, girls?" "Oh no," Margaret said dreamily. "It feels wonderful, like being wrapped in the warmest blanket on the coldest night." "Like floating in a peaceful dream," Catherine added, her voice equally distant. Eleanor stepped forward, her maternal instincts overriding her fear. "Children, listen to Mama. You need to come away from Thomas now." But when Margaret and Catherine turned to look at their mother, Charles saw with horror that their eyes had changed. The bright blue irises had darkened to the same hollow black as Thomas's own. "We can't leave Thomas, Mama," Margaret said with infinite sadness. "He needs us, and we need him, don't you understand? We're becoming something new together, something that doesn't have to choose between life and death." Professor Blackwood moved closer, his voice urgent. "Thomas, this isn't what your mother and I intended when we called you back. We wanted to see you again, to hold you, to tell you how sorry we were that we couldn't save you. We never meant for you to steal other children's lives." Thomas's expression hardened, and the shadows in the room seemed to deepen around him. "You didn't save me then, and you can't save me now. But I can save Margaret and Catherine from ever having to experience what I experienced. The terror of dying alone, the cold emptiness of being forgotten. They have parents who love them," Eleanor cried. "They have full lives ahead of them." "As I did," Thomas replied with ancient bitterness. "And yet here I am, proof that love and full lives mean nothing when death comes calling. At least this way they'll never have to face that terror. They'll pass from life to something else gently, surrounded by love." Charles realized with growing desperation that Thomas genuinely believed he was protecting his daughters, saving them from the trauma he had endured. In the ghost child's mind, this was an act of mercy. "There has to be another way," Charles said. "Professor Blackwood, isn't there some other ritual, some other solution?" The old man shook his head grimly. "The bond Thomas has formed with your children is growing stronger by the hour. Soon it will be irreversible. The only way to break it is to give him what he truly wants, a return to life, or—" He paused, his face pale. "Or what?" "Or to send him to final rest. But that would require destroying the anchor that keeps him in this world." "What anchor?" Professor Blackwood looked at Margaret and Catherine with infinite sadness. "Your daughters, Mr. Ashworth. They have become his connection to the living world. To banish Thomas permanently would mean—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but Charles understood. Saving his children would require sacrificing them, and letting them live would mean watching them slowly transform into something that was neither living nor dead. As if reading his thoughts, Thomas smiled with the innocence of a child and the knowledge of something far older and more terrible. "You're beginning to understand the impossible choice before you, aren't you, Mr. Ashworth? Love me and lose your daughters to the space between worlds. Destroy me and lose them to death itself. Either way, they can never truly be yours again." Outside, the unnatural twilight deepened, and somewhere in the distance church bells began tolling a funeral dirge that seemed to go on forever. Time was running out, and Charles could feel his daughters slipping further away with each passing moment, drawn into a realm where the living were not meant to venture. The transformation was accelerating, and soon Margaret and Catherine would be lost to him forever, regardless of what choice he made. By evening, Professor Blackwood had made a desperate decision. He sent word to Madame Zelda Vassiliev, Boston's most renowned spiritualist medium, requesting an emergency consultation. The Russian woman arrived at the Parker house just as the gas lamps were being lit throughout the city, her appearance as dramatic as her reputation suggested. Madame Vassiliev was a striking woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked black hair and eyes that seemed to pierce through to one's very soul. She wore dark robes adorned with mysterious symbols and carried with her an ornate wooden case containing the tools of her trade. "Professor Blackwood," she said in her heavily accented English, "when you sent message, I knew immediately this was matter of utmost urgency. The spiritual disturbance radiating from this place can be felt for miles." Charles and Eleanor watched nervously as the medium examined Margaret and Catherine, who sat unnaturally still throughout the inspection. Thomas remained invisible to all but the children and his father, though Madame Vassiliev's expression suggested she was acutely aware of his presence. "This is worse than you described in your message," she told Professor Blackwood grimly. "The dead child has created what we call a soul tether with these living children. He is slowly drawing their life essence into his own spiritual realm." "Can you break the connection?" Eleanor asked desperately. Madame Vassiliev studied the children more closely, her fingers moving in complex patterns in the air around them. Where her hands passed, faint traces of light seemed to follow, revealing ethereal threads connecting Margaret and Catherine to something unseen. "The bonds are strong, but not yet permanent," the medium announced. "However, we have perhaps only hours before the connection becomes irreversible. We must attempt to communicate with the spirit directly, to understand what will satisfy his need and release these children." "A séance?" Charles asked. "More than simple séance. We must perform what is called ritual of final crossing, ceremony that will either send the spirit to his proper rest or bind him permanently to this realm. There is no middle ground." Professor Blackwood paled. "The risks? If we fail, the children will be lost forever to the spirit world. If we succeed but choose wrong path, we may destroy the spirit entirely, along with any chance of reunion you have hoped for." As they prepared for the ritual, Margaret and Catherine began to speak in unison, their voices carrying an otherworldly harmony that raised goosebumps on everyone's arms. "Thomas says you shouldn't try to send him away," they said together. "He says if you force him to leave, he'll take us with him to keep us safe." Madame Vassiliev's expression grew even more grave. "The spirit is becoming desperate. This makes him infinitely more dangerous." The medium began arranging her ritual implements around the hotel room, black candles, crystals, and mirrors positioned according to ancient geometric patterns. She drew symbols on the floor using white chalk, creating a complex mandala that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. "Everyone must sit within the circle," she instructed. "Once I begin, no one may leave until the ritual is complete, regardless of what we see or hear." As they took their positions, Charles noticed that Margaret and Catherine moved with perfect synchronization, as if controlled by a single consciousness. When they sat, an empty chair materialized between them, and slowly Thomas began to take visible form. But this was not the innocent boy or even the burned spectre they had seen before. This Thomas was something else entirely, a creature that flickered between child and shadow, between human and something far more ancient and terrible. "Why do you seek to banish me?" Thomas asked, his voice now carrying the whispers of countless other lost souls. "I have found happiness with Margaret and Catherine. They have found peace with me. Why can't you simply let us be?" Madame Vassiliev began to chant in a language that predated Christianity, her words seeming to create ripples in the air itself. The candles flared higher, and the mirrors began to show not their reflections but images of other times and places. "Thomas Blackwood," she called out in a voice that resonated with authority, "I summon you to answer for your actions. You have violated the natural order, binding living souls to your own eternal torment." "I have saved them," Thomas screamed, and his voice shattered several of the hotel's windows. "I have given them something better than the cruel uncertainty of mortal life." In the mirrors, images began to appear, scenes from Thomas's death, showing the terrified 7-year-old boy trapped in his burning nursery, calling for parents who could not reach him. The visions were so vivid that everyone in the circle could smell the smoke and feel the heat of the flames. "You died in fear and pain," Madame Vassiliev said with compassion. "Your spirit was traumatized, unable to accept death. You have been trapped in that moment of terror for 3 years. And I will not let Margaret and Catherine experience such terror," Thomas replied, but his voice was now that of a frightened child rather than an ancient entity. "I will keep them safe with me always." Professor Blackwood leaned forward, tears streaming down his face. "Thomas, my son, your mother and I failed you in life. We weren't there when you needed us most, but we can be here for you now." For a moment, Thomas's form stabilized, and he looked like nothing more than a lonely, scared little boy. "I waited for you, Father. I waited in the burning room for so long, but you never came." "I'm here now," Professor Blackwood said gently. "I'm here, and I'm never leaving you again." Margaret and Catherine suddenly began to convulse, their bodies rigid as competing forces pulled at their souls. The life essence that Thomas had been slowly absorbing was being drawn back into them, but the process was tearing them apart. "Choose now!" Madame Vassiliev shouted over the supernatural storm that was building around them. "The spirit must either accept final rest or claim permanent residence in our world, but he cannot continue to exist in this liminal state." Thomas looked at his father, then at Margaret and Catherine, who were now crying out in pain as their souls were stretched between worlds. His face was a mask of anguish as he realized that his attempt to save them was actually destroying them. "I don't know how to let go," he whispered. And in that moment he was simply a 7-year-old child who had never learned that sometimes love means setting someone free. The mirrors suddenly exploded inward, filling the air with silver fragments that hung suspended like stars. Through the shattered glass, another figure began to emerge, a woman in a white dress with kind eyes and arms outstretched. "Thomas," she called softly, "it's time to come home." Professor Blackwood gasped. "Mary? My dear Mary." Thomas's mother had found a way to cross the barrier between worlds, drawn by the ritual and by her eternal love for her lost son. Her presence filled the room with warmth and light, pushing back the shadows that had gathered around Thomas. "I've been waiting for you, my darling boy," she said to Thomas. "Your father and I both have. We've been waiting to hold you again." The choice was no longer between Thomas and the living children. It was between holding on to his pain and fear, or accepting the love and peace that his parents offered. But even as Thomas reached toward his mother with trembling hands, the bonds connecting him to Margaret and Catherine grew tighter, as if his very existence depended on maintaining that connection. The ritual had reached its climax, but the outcome remained balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong move, one moment of weakness, and all three children would be lost forever. The presence of Mary Blackwood filled the hotel room with a luminous warmth that seemed to push back against the supernatural chaos surrounding them. She appeared as she had in life, a gentle woman with Thomas's dark eyes and a smile that spoke of infinite patience and love. But there was something else about her, an otherworldly serenity that came from having crossed the final threshold and found peace beyond. "Thomas, my precious boy," she said, her voice carrying the tender authority that only a mother's love could provide. "Look at what your fear has done to these innocent children." Margaret and Catherine were still convulsing, their small bodies racked with supernatural forces that threatened to tear their souls apart. Their eyes had rolled back, showing only white, and their breathing had become labored and irregular. Thomas stared at them in growing horror, finally understanding that his attempt to protect them was actually destroying them. "I didn't mean to hurt them, Mother. I only wanted them to be safe, to never feel the terror I felt when I died." "I know, darling," Mary said, moving closer to her son, "but love that clings too tightly becomes a prison. These children belong with their own parents, in their own world, just as you belong with us." Professor Blackwood reached out toward his wife, his voice breaking with emotion. "Mary, how is this possible? How are you here?" "Love transcends death, Jonathan," she replied without taking her eyes off Thomas. "Our love for Thomas has always been strong enough to bridge any gap, but he had to be ready to accept it." Madame Vassiliev's chanting intensified, her voice becoming a conduit for forces far beyond mortal understanding. The ritual circle blazed with ethereal light, and the very air seemed to vibrate with potential energy. "The window between worlds is fully open now," the medium called out urgently, "but it will not remain so for long. The choice must be made before the forces I have summoned tear this place apart." As if to emphasize her words, the hotel building began to shake violently. From other floors came the sounds of panicking guests and crashing furniture. The supernatural storm centered on their room was affecting the entire structure. Thomas looked at his parents, then at Margaret and Catherine, his face a mask of terrible indecision. "If I go with you, will I ever see them again? Will I remember them?" Mary's expression filled with maternal wisdom. "You will remember the joy they brought you, the way they made you feel alive again, but you will also be free from the pain and fear that has trapped you for so long. And Thomas, they will remember you too, but as a friend who played with them, not as the shadow that nearly consumed their souls." Eleanor, who had been silent throughout the ritual, suddenly spoke up. "Thomas, I want you to know that Margaret and Catherine love you, but they love you as children love a playmate, not as souls bound for eternity. If you take them with you, that innocent love will be destroyed." The ghost boy turned his hollow eyes toward Eleanor, and for a moment she saw not a supernatural entity, but simply a confused, frightened child who had been alone for far too long. "I've been so lonely," Thomas whispered. "For 3 years, I've been trapped in that moment of burning, calling for help that never came. When Margaret and Catherine accepted me, when they played with me and laughed with me, it was the first time I felt warm again." "You'll never be lonely again," Professor Blackwood promised, tears streaming down his aged face. "Your mother and I will be with you always. And Thomas, there are other children where we're going, children who have crossed over and are waiting for friends to play with." Thomas's form began to flicker more rapidly, torn between the world of the living and the realm beyond death. The bonds connecting him to Margaret and Catherine pulsed like living things, growing tighter as his anguish increased. Suddenly Margaret spoke, though her voice was strained and weak. "Thomas, it's okay. You can let go." Catherine nodded with tremendous effort. We'll always remember playing with you, but you need to go home now." The simple, innocent acceptance in their voices broke something fundamental in Thomas's supernatural defenses. He realized that in trying to possess them completely, he had been destroying the very thing he loved most about them, their pure, uncomplicated affection. "I'm scared," Thomas admitted, his voice now purely that of a 7-year-old child. "What if it hurts to die again?" Mary moved closer, her ethereal form beginning to embrace her son. "You're not dying again, darling. You're finally finishing what was interrupted 3 years ago. You're finally coming home." As mother and son touched, a brilliant light filled the room, so intense that everyone else had to shield their eyes. When the radiance faded slightly, Thomas appeared more solid than he had since his death, but also more at peace. "Will you forgive me?" he asked his parents. "For what I almost did to Margaret and Catherine?" "There's nothing to forgive," Professor Blackwood said firmly. "You were a frightened child, trying to create the family you lost. Any parent would understand that." Thomas turned to look at Margaret and Catherine one last time. As he did, the supernatural bonds connecting them began to dissolve, releasing their souls back to their own bodies. Color returned to their faces, and their breathing became steady once more. "Thank you," Thomas said to them softly. "Thank you for making me feel alive again, even if it was only for a little while." "Will we see you again?" Margaret asked weakly. Thomas smiled, and for the first time since his death it was a smile of pure joy rather than desperate need. "Maybe someday, when you're very old and it's your time to cross over, but not for a very, very long time." Mary began to fade, drawing Thomas with her toward whatever realm awaited beyond the veil of death. But as they prepared to leave, she turned to address Charles and Eleanor directly. "Love your children while you have them," she said with the authority of a mother who had lost her child too soon. "Hold them close, but not so close that they can't breathe. And remember that some bonds are strong enough to survive even death itself." With those words, both mother and son began to fade, their forms becoming translucent as they prepared for their final journey together. Thomas looked back one last time, waving goodbye to Margaret and Catherine, with the innocent gesture of a child saying farewell to beloved friends. "Goodbye, Thomas," the girls whispered together, and for the first time in days, their voices were purely their own. As the spirits of the Blackwood family finally crossed over to their eternal rest, the supernatural storm that had raged around them began to subside. The mirrors stopped showing visions of other times and places, the candles burned with normal flames, and the oppressive weight that had pressed down on them all lifted like fog before the morning sun. But even as peace returned to the hotel room, everyone present knew they had witnessed something that would change them forever. The veil between life and death had been pulled aside, revealing truths about love, loss, and the bonds that connect all souls across the vast expanse of eternity. The silence that followed Thomas's departure was profound, like the hush that falls over a cemetery at midnight. Margaret and Catherine lay exhausted on their beds, their breathing finally steady and natural, though their faces remained pale from their supernatural ordeal. Madame Vassiliev carefully dismantled her ritual circle, collecting her implements with the reverent precision of someone who understood the forces she had been channeling. Professor Blackwood sat in stunned silence, staring at the spot where his wife and son had last appeared. His face showed a complex mixture of grief and relief. The sorrow of final farewell, tempered by the peace of knowing his family was truly together at last. "Is it over?" Eleanor asked quietly, afraid that speaking too loudly might somehow summon Thomas back from whatever realm he had entered. "The spirit has crossed over," Madame Vassiliev confirmed, though her expression remained troubled. "But such powerful supernatural events leave what we call residual echoes. Your daughters have been touched by forces beyond the natural world. There may be consequences." Charles felt his heart clench with new fear. "What kind of consequences?" "Nothing dangerous," the medium assured him quickly, "but children who have been so close to the spirit realm often retain certain sensitivities. They may see or hear things that others cannot, experience vivid dreams of otherworldly places, or possess unusual intuition about supernatural matters." As if to prove her point, Margaret stirred on her bed and spoke without opening her eyes. "There are other spirits in this hotel," she said in a voice still weak from her ordeal. "Sad ones who died here long ago. They're watching us from the mirrors." Eleanor moved protectively toward her daughter, but Madame Vassiliev held up a calming hand. "Do not fear this gift. Many who have touched the spirit realm become bridges between worlds, able to help lost souls find peace. Your daughters may grow up to help others as I have done." Catherine opened her eyes and looked directly at the medium. "Will we be able to help other children like Thomas? Other spirits who are lost and afraid?" "Perhaps, little one. But that is a choice you must make when you are older, and understand the full weight of such a calling." Professor Blackwood finally spoke, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Mr. Ashworth, I must ask your forgiveness for the danger my actions brought to your family. When my wife and I performed that ritual 6 months ago, we never considered that our son might attach himself to other children." Charles studied the elderly professor, seeing not the learned academic, but a broken father who had made a desperate decision out of love and grief. "Professor, I cannot fault a parent for wanting to see their child again, but what happens now? Will other spirits be drawn to my daughters because of this experience?" "It is possible," Madame Vassiliev admitted, "but I will teach you protective rituals, ways to shield your home and family from unwanted supernatural attention." And Professor Blackwood, if you are willing, could serve as an advisor. His studies of the occult have given him knowledge that few possess. Over the following days, as the family remained at the Parker house, while their Marlborough Street mansion was assessed for supernatural residue, the changes in Margaret and Catherine became more apparent. They spoke frequently of seeing shadow people in their peripheral vision, spirits of the deceased who lingered in places of significance to their former lives. The girls handled these experiences with remarkable maturity, as if their encounter with Thomas had aged them beyond their years. They no longer seemed frightened by the supernatural. Instead, they showed a compassionate understanding that concerned and amazed their parents in equal measure. "I saw a lady in the hotel lobby today," Catherine reported during breakfast 3 days after the séance. "She was very sad and kept walking toward the stairs, but she could never reach them. I think she died in a fire here a long time ago." Margaret nodded seriously. "We tried to tell her it was okay to go toward the light like Thomas did, but she couldn't hear us yet. Maybe she needs more help." Eleanor exchanged worried glances with Charles. Their daughters were adapting to their new spiritual sensitivity with an ease that was both reassuring and unsettling. Professor Blackwood, who had aged visibly since the events in their hotel room, spent his days researching protective measures and teaching Charles about the various supernatural phenomena that might affect the family. The old man seemed driven by a need to atone for the danger his grief had created. "Spirits are drawn to places of emotional significance," he explained, as they sat in the hotel's library. "Your daughters experienced something profound here. They may find that certain locations, old houses, cemeteries, places where tragedy occurred, will feel different to them now. Are they in danger? Not directly, but they may be called upon to help lost spirits, as they already seem inclined to do. It will be important to teach them to protect themselves, to maintain boundaries between the world of the living and the realm of the dead." A week after Thomas's crossing, the family received word from the fire department that their house had been thoroughly inspected and was safe to inhabit again. The nursery had been completely rebuilt, with no trace of the supernatural fire that had served as Thomas's final manifestation. But when they returned to Marlborough Street, all 4 family members could feel the difference immediately. The house no longer carried the oppressive weight it had before Thomas's arrival. The shadows seemed lighter, the rooms more welcoming. It was as if the spirit's departure had cleansed the entire structure of its tragic history. Bridget O'Malley was waiting for them, having spent the week staying with relatives in South Boston. She greeted the family with obvious relief, though her eyes showed the wariness of someone who had lived through supernatural events beyond her understanding. "The house feels different now," she said, as she helped them bring their luggage inside. "Peaceful-like, as if a great weight has been lifted from it." That evening, as Charles tucked Margaret and Catherine into their beds in the restored nursery, his younger daughter looked up at him with eyes that seemed far older than her 6 years. "Papa, Thomas left us something," she said quietly. "What do you mean?" "Not something we can touch," Margaret explained from her own bed. "Something inside us. We can feel when people are sad or scared, even when they try to hide it, and we can see the good spirits who watch over people, protecting them." Charles felt a mixture of pride and concern. His daughters had been forever changed by their encounter with the supernatural, marked by forces beyond normal human experience. But rather than being traumatized, they seemed to have gained a profound empathy and understanding that might serve them well in life. "Will you use this gift to help others?" he asked. Both girls nodded solemnly. "Thomas taught us that being alone is the scariest thing in the world," Catherine said. "We never want anyone to feel that lonely and afraid." As Charles kissed his daughters goodnight and dimmed the gas lamps, he realized that while Thomas's story had ended in tragedy and redemption, his daughter's story was just beginning. They would grow up walking between 2 worlds, serving as bridges between the living and the dead, helping lost souls find their way home. And perhaps in some cosmic sense of justice, that was exactly what Thomas Blackwood had intended all along, not to steal their lives, but to give them a purpose that would honor his memory and help heal the wounds that exist between the world of the living and the realm beyond death. 2 weeks had passed since the family's return to Marlborough Street, and life had begun to settle into a new rhythm. Margaret and Catherine attended their lessons with renewed focus, though their governess, Miss Adelaide Thornton, noted with concern how the children sometimes paused in their studies to look at empty corners of the room with expressions of gentle sympathy. It was during one of these quiet autumn afternoons that Charles remembered the portrait copies he had hidden in his study safe. Edmund Whitmore had created 3 prints before destroying the original photographic plate, and Charles had locked them away, uncertain what to do with images that captured far more than any camera should have been able to see. Sitting alone in his study, while Eleanor took the children for their afternoon walk in the public garden, Charles retrieved the photographs from the safe. The images were just as disturbing as he remembered. Thomas appeared as both living child and burned spectre, his form overlapping reality in ways that defied natural law. But as he studied the portraits more carefully in the daylight streaming through his study windows, Charles noticed something he had missed before. In the background of the photograph, barely visible among the shadows of the parlor, were additional figures, the ghostly forms of Professor and Mrs. Blackwood stood behind their son, their faces etched with the same desperate longing he had seen during the séance. More disturbing still, Charles could now see other children in the photograph, shadow figures of various ages scattered throughout the room like echoes from different time periods. The house, it seemed, had been home to many young spirits over the years, all drawn to the warmth of living families, but unable to fully cross into their world. A soft knock at the study door interrupted his examination. "Come in," he called, quickly turning the photographs face down on his desk. To his surprise, it was Professor Blackwood who entered, carrying a leather portfolio under his arm. The old man had visited several times since their return home, ostensibly to check on the family's well-being, but actually, Charles suspected, because he needed the connection to others who had shared his supernatural experience. "I hope I'm not intruding," Professor Blackwood said, noting Charles's startled expression. "Mrs. O'Malley let me in. I have something I thought you should see." "Of course. Please sit." Charles gestured to the chair across from his desk, leaving the photographs where they lay. Professor Blackwood opened his portfolio and withdrew a collection of old documents and newspaper clippings. "I've been researching the history of this house more thoroughly, and I've made some disturbing discoveries about the children who have lived here over the past 50 years. He spread the papers across Charles's desk, revealing a pattern that sent chills down the younger man's spine. Newspaper obituaries dating back to 1858 told stories of children who had died in the house under various circumstances: accidents, illnesses, even violence. But what connected all these tragedies was the recurring mention of other children seen playing in the house shortly before each death. "My God," Charles whispered, studying a yellowed clipping from 1873. This article describes a 7-year-old girl who claimed to have invisible playmates in the nursery. She died of pneumonia a week later. And here, Professor Blackwood pointed to another clipping, a report from 1885 about twin boys who spoke of playing with the shadow children who lived in the walls. Both boys died in a house fire that was never fully explained. Charles felt his blood turn cold as the pattern became clear. The spirits of dead children have been gathering in this house for decades, haven't they? Thomas wasn't the first. "I believe this house sits on what occultists call a confluence point, a place where the barrier between the world of the living and the realm of the dead is naturally thin. Dead children are drawn here because they sense the presence of living children, but their attempts to connect with the living world have repeatedly resulted in tragedy." "But why didn't Thomas's presence affect Margaret and Catherine the same way?" Professor Blackwood's expression grew thoughtful. "I believe it was because Thomas was different from the others. His death was recent, and more importantly, he was called back by a specific ritual performed by people who loved him. The other spirits were drawn here by instinct and desperation. But Thomas came back with a purpose and the power to manifest physically." Charles turned over one of the portrait copies, showing it to the professor. "Then explain this. Look carefully at the background." Professor Blackwood studied the photograph through his wire-rimmed spectacles, his face growing pale as he recognized the additional figures captured by Whitmore's camera. "Dear God, it appears your daughters weren't just playing with Thomas. They were surrounded by the spirits of all the children who have died in this house over the past half-century. Are Margaret and Catherine still in danger? I don't believe so. Thomas's crossing seems to have created a kind of spiritual evacuation. When he found peace and moved on, he opened a pathway that allowed the other trapped souls to follow. Your daughters may have inadvertently served as catalysts for a mass spiritual cleansing." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of children's laughter echoed from the front hallway as Eleanor returned with Margaret and Catherine from their walk. But there was something different about the laughter. It seemed to carry additional voices, as if more children were playing than just the two living ones. Charles and Professor Blackwood exchanged concerned glances and moved quickly to investigate. They found Eleanor in the foyer, helping the girls remove their coats while both children chatted excitedly about their afternoon adventures. "Papa, we met the most wonderful children in the garden," Margaret announced, her eyes bright with excitement. "They were playing by the pond, but when other people walked by, only we could see them. They told us they used to live in houses like ours," Catherine added. "But they're not sad anymore because they're together now, and they know how to find their families in the bright place beyond the shadows." Eleanor looked confused by her daughter's words, but Charles and Professor Blackwood understood immediately. The spirits that had been trapped in their house for decades had indeed followed Thomas's path to the afterlife, but they had briefly returned to thank the children who had unwittingly helped set them free. "Did they say anything else?" Professor Blackwood asked gently. Margaret nodded seriously. "They said thank you for showing them the way home. And they wanted us to know that our house will be truly peaceful now, because all the lonely children have found their families again." Over the following days, the truth of those words became evident. The house on Marlborough Street took on a warmth and tranquility it had never possessed before. Servants reported that the mysterious cold spots and unexplained sounds that had occasionally troubled the household had completely disappeared. Even the neighborhood cats, who had previously avoided the property, began sunning themselves on the front steps. But perhaps most significantly, Margaret and Catherine's supernatural sensitivity began to manifest in positive ways. They showed an uncanny ability to comfort adults who were grieving, often knowing exactly what to say to bring peace to troubled hearts. Their governess noted that they seemed to possess wisdom far beyond their years when it came to matters of loss and healing. "It's as if they understand something about death that most people never learn," Miss Thornton confided to Eleanor. "When my own mother passed last month, little Catherine took my hand and told me that the sad feeling in my heart would become a warm feeling when I remembered all the love my mother had given me." How does a 6-year-old know such things? Eleanor shared this conversation with Charles that evening as they sat in their parlor, the same room where the fateful portrait had been taken. The space now felt completely different, lighter, more welcoming, free from the shadows that had once gathered in its corners. "Perhaps," Charles suggested, "Thomas's final gift to our daughters wasn't the burden of supernatural sensitivity, but the blessing of understanding. They've learned that death is not an ending, but a transformation, and that love is the bridge that connects all souls across every boundary." As if to confirm his words, they heard Margaret and Catherine laughing together in their nursery upstairs, their voices joined by what sounded like the faint echo of another child's laughter. Not the desperate, clinging presence of a trapped spirit, but the joyful voice of a friend, saying a final, peaceful goodbye. The portrait that had revealed so many supernatural secrets now seemed like a relic from another time, a window into events that had forever changed their understanding of life, death, and the bonds that connect all families across the vast expanse of eternity. The autumn of 1909 brought a crispness to the Boston air that reminded Charles of that fateful evening when Thomas had first made himself known to their family. A full year had passed since the supernatural events that had forever changed the Ashworth household, and the anniversary weighed heavily on his mind as he walked through the fallen leaves of Beacon Hill. Margaret and Catherine, now 9 and 7 respectively, had grown into remarkable young women whose unusual gifts had become a source of both pride and gentle concern for their parents. Their reputation for comforting the bereaved had spread quietly through Boston's social circles, and Eleanor often received requests from other families asking if the girls might visit relatives who were struggling with loss. "It's not natural for children so young to have such wisdom about death," Eleanor had confided to Charles just that morning. "Sometimes I wonder if we should seek medical consultation about their unusual insights." But Charles had come to see his daughter's abilities not as a burden, but as a calling. They helped people in ways that conventional comfort could not, offering perspectives that seemed to come from direct knowledge of the world beyond death. On this particular afternoon, Charles found himself drawn to visit Professor Blackwood at his Cambridge home. The elderly academic had become something of a surrogate grandfather to Margaret and Catherine, and his research into supernatural phenomena had evolved into a more scholarly pursuit of helping other families who encountered similar situations. The professor's study was lined with books on spiritualism, psychology, and theological studies of the afterlife. When Charles arrived, he found the old man at his desk surrounded by correspondence from people across New England who had heard of his expertise. "Charles, how good to see you," Professor Blackwood said, rising to greet his visitor. "I was just reviewing a letter from a family in Salem who believe their home is haunted by a child who died there in the 1800s. They specifically asked if I might bring Margaret and Catherine to help assess the situation. Charles took the offered seat, noting how much healthier Professor Blackwood looked compared to the broken man he had been a year ago. Finding peace with Thomas's crossing and dedicating himself to helping other families had given the professor new purpose and vitality. Eleanor and I have been discussing whether we should allow the girls to take on such responsibilities, Charles admitted. They're still so young, and yet they seem to understand these situations better than adults who have studied them for years. Perhaps that's precisely why they're so effective, Professor Blackwood suggested. Children who have touched the spirit realm retain an innocence and openness that adults lose over time. Your daughters don't approach supernatural encounters with fear or skepticism. They approach them with love and acceptance. To illustrate his point, Professor Blackwood showed Charles a collection of letters and testimonials from families the girls had helped over the past year. A widow in Concord wrote of how Catherine had helped her young son stop having nightmares about his deceased father by explaining that Daddy was watching over him from the sunny place where all the love goes. A family in Worcester described how Margaret had somehow convinced the spirit of their departed grandmother to stop moving furniture and instead find peace by following the golden path to where Grandpa was waiting. They've helped more than 24 families this year, Professor Blackwood noted. Not through elaborate rituals or complex ceremonies, but through simple, compassionate communication. They seem to serve as translators between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Charles studied the letters, feeling a mixture of pride and protective concern. But what about their own childhood, their own normal development? From what I've observed, they're remarkably well-adjusted children who happen to possess an extraordinary gift. They play, they study, they laugh and argue like any siblings. But when they encounter someone in spiritual distress, whether living or dead, they respond with a maturity and compassion that suggests their experience with Thomas fundamentally changed them for the better. That evening, Charles returned home to find his daughters in the parlor with Eleanor, working on their needlepoint, while discussing their lessons from that day. But as he watched them, he noticed something that made him pause in the doorway. Margaret and Catherine occasionally glanced toward the corner of the room where Thomas had first appeared to them over a year ago, not with fear or sadness, but with the gentle acknowledgement one might give to a cherished memory. It was as if they could still sense some echo of their supernatural friend, not as a haunting presence, but as a warm reminder of the love that had ultimately set him free. "Papa," Catherine called out, noticing him in the doorway. "We've been talking about the family in Lexington who wrote to Professor Blackwood, the little boy who died in their house last winter." "Oh?" Charles entered the room and settled into his favorite chair by the fireplace. "He's not scary or angry," Margaret added, looking up from her embroidery. "He's just confused about why his mama cries all the time. He doesn't understand that she can't see him anymore." "Would you like to help that family?" Charles asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Both girls nodded earnestly. "We could explain to the little boy that his mama isn't crying because she doesn't love him," Catherine said. "She's crying because she misses him. And we could help his mama understand that he's still there, just in a different way." Eleanor looked at Charles with an expression that mixed motherly concern with profound respect for their daughter's compassion. They had long since moved past questioning whether the girls' abilities were real. Too many families had been helped. Too many troubled spirits had found peace through their intervention. "Very well," Charles decided. "We'll write to Professor Blackwood tomorrow and arrange a visit to Lexington. But you must promise to be careful and to tell us immediately if you ever feel frightened or overwhelmed." "We promise, Papa," both girls said in unison, a habit they had retained from their time under Thomas's influence, though now it seemed to arise from their shared sense of purpose rather than supernatural compulsion. That night, as Charles and Eleanor prepared for bed, they talked quietly about the remarkable path their daughters' lives had taken. "Do you ever regret what happened?" Eleanor asked. "The supernatural events that changed them so dramatically." Charles considered the question carefully. "I regret the danger they were in, and I regret Thomas's suffering, but I can't regret the compassion and wisdom they gained from the experience. They're helping to heal wounds that conventional medicine and theology cannot touch. Sometimes I wonder what Thomas would think if he could see them now," Eleanor mused, "using the sensitivity he awakened in them to help other lost children find peace." "I think," Charles replied, "he would be very proud. His greatest fear was being alone and forgotten, but through Margaret and Catherine, his story continues to help other children avoid that same fate. In a way, he's still part of our family, not as a haunting presence, but as an inspiration for the good work our daughters are doing." Outside their bedroom window, The gas lamps of Marlborough Street flickered in the autumn wind, casting dancing shadows that no longer held any terror for the Ashworth family. They had learned that not all shadows concealed threats. Sometimes they simply marked the places where love had touched the darkness and transformed it into light. And in the nursery down the hall, Margaret and Catherine slept peacefully, their dreams filled not with supernatural terrors, but with visions of reunion and healing, of lost souls finding their way home, and of the endless bridges that love builds between all worlds, both seen and unseen. The winter of 1910 brought with it a case that would test everything Margaret and Catherine had learned about the delicate balance between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. A telegram arrived on a bitter February morning from the town of Marblehead, carrying news that filled Professor Blackwood with both excitement and dread. The Whitmore orphanage has been experiencing supernatural disturbances for 3 months, he explained to Charles and Eleanor as they gathered in the Ashworth parlour, multiple child spirits, all seeming to manifest simultaneously. The situation has become so severe that the children living there are refusing to sleep in their dormitories. Charles felt a familiar chill at the mention of multiple child spirits. How many are we talking about? According to the reports, at least 7 distinct apparitions have been seen by both the children and the staff. They appear to be spirits of former residents who died at the orphanage over the past 30 years, victims of disease, accidents, and neglect. Eleanor wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. Why haven't these spirits moved on like the others? What makes this situation different? Professor Blackwood's expression was grave. I believe they're being held in place by something far more powerful than simple attachment to their former home. The reports describe a presence that the living children call the Dark Mother, an adult spirit who seems to be gathering the dead children around her, preventing them from crossing over. Margaret and Catherine, who had been quietly listening from their seats by the fireplace, exchanged glances that spoke of shared understanding beyond their years. She's afraid of being alone, Margaret said softly, just like Thomas was, but stronger and more desperate. The dead children want to go to the light, Catherine added, but she won't let them. She thinks if she keeps them with her, she can pretend to be alive again. The accuracy of their assessment without having visited the orphanage sent a shiver through the adults present. Over the past year and a half, the girls had demonstrated an increasingly sophisticated understanding of supernatural psychology, but their insight into this particular case seemed to come from a deeper source. Would you be willing to help? Professor Blackwood asked gently. I must warn you, this may be the most dangerous situation we've encountered. A spirit powerful enough to hold 7 other souls in thrall could potentially pose a serious threat to living children. Both girls nodded without hesitation, though Charles noticed a solemnity in their expressions that hadn't been present in their previous cases. We have to help them, Margaret said simply. The dead children are suffering, and the living children are scared. No one should have to live with that kind of fear. The journey to Marblehead took most of a grey winter day, the train carrying them through snow-covered landscapes that seemed to mirror the bleakness of their destination. The Whitmore orphanage stood on a windswept hill overlooking the Atlantic, a 3-story brick building that had housed unwanted children for nearly 50 years. Mrs. Abigail Crane, the orphanage director, met them at the entrance with obvious relief. She was a stern but kind woman in her 60s, whose dedication to the children in her care was evident in every line of her weathered face. Thank goodness you've come, she said, leading them through corridors that echoed with whispered voices and half-seen movements in peripheral vision. The situation has become unbearable. The children are afraid to be alone, and the staff are beginning to talk of abandoning their positions. As they walked through the building, Margaret and Catherine moved with the careful attention of soldiers entering a battlefield. Their eyes tracked movements that others couldn't see, and they occasionally paused to listen to sounds that only they could hear. The dead children are everywhere, Catherine whispered to her sister, but they're all clustered around the 3rd floor near the old nursery. She's keeping them there, Margaret replied, her voice tight with concern. She won't let them play or explore or find peace. She's making them pretend to be her children. Mrs. Crane overheard their exchange and nodded grimly. The disturbances are strongest on the 3rd floor. That's where we found the body of Miss Helena Thorne 20 years ago. She was a woman who applied to work here as a matron, but we discovered she had lost her own children to scarlet fever and was unstable in her grief. She locked herself in the old nursery and took poison rather than face a world without children to care for. Professor Blackwood made notes in his leather journal. So we're dealing with a maternal spirit whose desire to nurture has become twisted into a need to possess. As they climbed the stairs to the third floor, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the sound of children's voices became audible to everyone present, not the happy chatter of living children, but the subdued murmurs of souls trapped in an endless, joyless routine. The third-floor hallway stretched before them like a gauntlet, lined with doors that led to dormitories and classrooms that had been abandoned due to the supernatural activity. At the far end stood the door to the old nursery, from behind which came the sound of a woman's voice singing a lullaby that seemed to drag on for eternity. "She's in there," Margaret said, pointing toward the nursery, "and all the dead children are with her. But Papa, there's something else, something that's been feeding on their trapped energy and growing stronger." Before Charles could ask what she meant, the nursery door swung open with a bang that echoed through the building like a gunshot. A wave of supernatural cold swept down the hallway, carrying with it the scent of flowers that had been dead for decades. From the darkness of the nursery emerged a figure that made everyone present take an involuntary step backward. Helena Thorne appeared as she had in life, a tall, gaunt woman in a black dress with greying hair pulled back severely. But her eyes held the wild desperation of someone who had crossed the line between grief and madness. "More children," she said in a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "How wonderful! Come, dears. It's time for lessons. You must learn to be good children, quiet children, children who never leave their mother." Behind her, barely visible in the shadows of the nursery, moved the forms of 7 dead children, ranging in age from toddlers to young teenagers. Their faces were blank, their movements mechanical, as if they were dolls being manipulated by an unseen puppeteer. Margaret and Catherine stepped forward, their small hands clasped together for strength and comfort. "Miss Thorne," Margaret said with the polite firmness of a well-bred child addressing an adult, "these children don't belong to you. They have their own families waiting for them in the bright place." Helena's expression twisted with rage and denial. "I am their mother now. I saved them from loneliness and abandonment. They will never leave me, never grow old, never die again." "But they're already dead," Catherine said gently. "And so are you. Keeping them here isn't saving them. It's hurting them." The spirit woman's form began to flicker between the composed matron and something far more terrible, a creature of pure need and desperation that had been feeding on the trapped souls for 2 decades. "You don't understand," Helena shrieked, her voice now carrying supernatural power that shattered several windows along the hallway. "Children always leave. They grow up, they forget, they die, but these children will stay with me forever." As her rage intensified, the dead children behind her began to move with more animation, reaching toward Margaret and Catherine with expressions of desperate hope. They were trying to communicate something urgent, something that could change the outcome of this supernatural standoff. Professor Blackwood stepped protectively closer to his young companions. "Helena Thorne, release these children immediately. You have no right to hold their souls captive." "I have every right," the spirit woman screamed. "I am their mother. I am the only mother they need." But Margaret had heard what the dead children were trying to tell her, and her face lit up with understanding. "Miss Thorne," she said clearly, "your own children are here too. They've been trying to reach you for 20 years, but you couldn't see them because you were so focused on these other children." Helena's rage faltered, replaced by confusion and desperate hope. "My children? My Mary and James? And little Samuel?" Catherine nodded, tears streaming down her face as she saw what Margaret had discovered. "They're standing right behind you, Miss Thorne. They've been waiting for you to turn around, to see them, to come home with them." For the first time in 2 decades, Helena Thorne turned away from the children she had been obsessively guarding. Behind her stood 3 small figures, her own children, who had died of scarlet fever and had been waiting patiently for their mother to join them in the afterlife. The reunion was heartbreaking and beautiful. Helena's twisted features softened with love and recognition as she knelt to embrace the children she had never stopped mourning. As she did, the bonds holding the orphanage spirits began to dissolve, freeing them to follow their own paths to peace. But the ordeal was not over. 20 years of feeding on trapped souls had created something else in that nursery, a dark entity that existed purely to consume spiritual energy. As Helena and her children began to fade toward the light, this shadow creature emerged from the corners of the room, desperate to maintain its supernatural feeding ground. Margaret and Catherine stood together, facing a darkness that threatened to swallow everything in its path. The final test of their abilities was about to begin. The shadow entity that emerged from the corners of the nursery was unlike anything the Ashworth family had encountered before. It was not the confused spirit of a dead person, but something that had been born from 2 decades of feeding on trapped souls and twisted emotions. It writhed and pulsed with a hunger that seemed to devour light itself, growing larger and more substantial with each passing moment. "Get the children back!" Charles shouted, but Margaret and Catherine stood their ground, their small hands still clasped together as they faced the advancing darkness. "We can't run," Margaret said with a calmness that belied her 9 years. "If we leave now, it will follow us. It will find other children to feed on. Besides," Catherine added, her 7-year-old voice carrying wisdom far beyond her age, "we know something it doesn't. We know what Thomas taught us." The shadow creature pressed closer, its form shifting between writhing tentacles of darkness and gaping mouths that seemed to swallow sound itself. But as it approached the 2 girls, something unexpected happened. They began to glow with a soft, warm light that emanated from their joined hands. "Love is stronger than hunger," Margaret said, her voice now carrying an echo of all the children they had helped over the past 1.5 years. "Love is stronger than fear. And love never really dies," Catherine continued. "It just changes form and finds new ways to reach the people who need it." The light surrounding the girls intensified, and within that radiance, figures began to appear. Not just Thomas, but all the children whose spirits they had helped find peace. The orphanage spirits who had just been freed joined them, along with the shadow children from their own house, and dozens of others whose souls had been touched by Margaret and Catherine's compassion. Professor Blackwood watched in awe as what appeared to be an army of child spirits materialized around his young companions. "They're not alone," he whispered. "They're never alone." Eleanor clasped Charles's hand as they witnessed their daughters, calling upon every soul they had ever helped, creating a network of spiritual protection that spanned the gap between life and death. The shadow entity recoiled from the growing light, its form beginning to lose cohesion as it was confronted by the very thing it could never understand or consume: love freely given, without expectation of return. "You feed on trapped souls and twisted emotions," Margaret said to the creature, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had walked between worlds and chosen light over darkness. "But we are connected to souls who have found peace, children who have been reunited with their families. You cannot consume what we offer," Catherine added, "because love multiplies when it's shared. The more you try to take, the stronger it becomes." The assembled spirits began to move in a slow circle around Margaret and Catherine, their forms becoming more solid and luminous with each revolution. They were creating what Professor Blackwood recognized as a spiritual vortex, not the dark kind that trapped souls, but a pathway of light that led directly to whatever realm awaited beyond death. Helena Thorne appeared one last time, no longer the twisted creature of obsession, but the loving mother she had been before grief consumed her. She stood with her own 3 children, but now she also held hands with the 7 orphanage spirits she had been holding captive. "Thank you," she said to Margaret and Catherine, her voice carrying the peace of someone who had finally found forgiveness for herself. "You showed me that keeping children close means teaching them how to fly, not clipping their wings." As Helena and all the children she had been connected to began to move toward the tunnel of light, the shadow entity made one final desperate attempt to maintain its hold on the physical world. It lunged toward Margaret and Catherine, seeking to consume their life force and use their spiritual sensitivity as an anchor to remain in the world of the living. But in that moment, Thomas Blackwood stepped between the creature and the girls who had once been his friends. He appeared not as the burned spectre from the photograph, but as the healthy, happy child he would have become if he had lived, a boy who had learned that true love sometimes means letting go. "You cannot have them," Thomas said simply. "They belong to the light, just as I do now." The shadow entity struck Thomas's spirit form and immediately began to dissolve. It had been created by feeding on trapped souls and negative emotions, but Thomas was no longer trapped. He had found peace, family, and purpose. Contact with such a soul was like acid to the creature's very essence. As the shadow entity disintegrated into nothingness, the spiritual vortex reached its crescendo. Helena Thorne and the orphanage children stepped into the light and vanished, followed by the various spirits who had answered Margaret and Catherine's call for help. Thomas was the last to leave. He approached the 2 girls who had taught him about love, loss, and the courage required to say goodbye. "Will we see you again?" Catherine asked, though she already knew the answer. "When it's your time, many, many years from now," Thomas replied with a smile that held all the warmth of eternal summer. "But until then, remember what we learned together. that families are not just made of blood, but of love, and love never truly ends. It just finds new ways to shine. With those words, Thomas Blackwood stepped into the light and was gone, not as a departing spirit, but as a soul finally, completely at peace. The nursery returned to normal temperature immediately. Broken windows mended themselves, and the oppressive atmosphere that had plagued the orphanage for months lifted like fog before the morning sun. In the sudden silence, they could hear the sound of living children laughing in the dormitories below, the first genuine laughter the building had heard in far too long. Mrs. Crane approached Margaret and Catherine with tears in her eyes. "How can I ever thank you? Those poor souls had been trapped here for so long, and the living children were beginning to lose hope." "You don't need to thank us," Margaret replied. "We were just doing what Thomas taught us, helping lost children find their way home." On the train back to Boston that evening, as the family watched the winter landscape roll past in the gathering darkness, Charles reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple family portrait 2 years earlier. "Do you think this is what Thomas always intended?" he asked Professor Blackwood. "That our encounter with him would lead to all of this?" The old professor considered the question carefully. "I think Thomas was simply a lonely child who wanted to belong to a family, but your daughters transformed that encounter into something larger, a calling to help other lost souls. They took his pain and turned it into purpose." Eleanor looked at Margaret and Catherine, who were sleeping peacefully against each other, as the train rocked gently along the tracks. What kind of future awaits them? Will they always be called upon to handle such situations? "I believe they will choose their own path," Professor Blackwood replied. "But they will never lose the gift Thomas helped awaken in them, the ability to see beyond the boundary between life and death, and to offer comfort to those who need it most." Years later, when Margaret and Catherine Ashworth had grown into remarkable women who devoted their lives to helping others heal from loss and trauma, they would often speak of the ghost boy who had taught them that love was the bridge connecting all souls across every distance and every boundary. The portrait that had started it all remained in Charles's study, but the supernatural terror it had once represented had been transformed into something else entirely, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, love could find a way to create light. And on quiet evenings when the gas lamps flickered in just the right way, and the shadows fell at precisely the correct angle, residents of Marlborough Street would sometimes hear the sound of children's laughter drifting from the Ashworth house, not the desperate clinging of trapped spirits, but the joyful echo of souls who had learned that the strongest bonds are those that give others the freedom to be truly free. The story of Thomas Blackwood had ended not in horror but in hope, proving that sometimes the most powerful ghost stories are not about the dead haunting the living, but about how the living can help the dead find eternal peace. And in that peace, all families, whether bound by blood or by love, could finally, truly come home.